My name is Diana Allan, and I'm currently living in Boston, in America. I'm a British national, although I also have American citizenship. My father is American and my mother is British. And I was born in Beirut, actually, so that's one of my connections to the Middle East. I'm an anthropologist and a filmmaker by training. I have a PhD in anthropology. Well, it was partly my own background. Having been born in the Middle East, and both my parents have been very involved in Palestinian issues. But I think the experience of working in Gaza in 1995 was I think I was 19 then, and it was had a very strong impact on me, the injustice of the situation, the way that people are living. And so I became, I was studying at Cambridge University. I was doing my undergraduate degree then, and I became much more involved in Palestinian activism. I think people often, when you think of a camp, you think of tents, or you think of something very temporary, that it's something that's put up and then dismantled very quickly. And obviously in the case of, the Palestinian refugee community in Lebanon, they've been there for 61 years, so these have become, very permanent communities. There are some camps in Lebanon that are quite distinct and sort of separate from, Lebanese communities, and they don't have walls, but they're kind of bounded and separate communities. And then there are other ones that are on the peripheries of towns and have kind of almost, have become part of the poorer neighborhoods in the suburbs. And Shatila is an example of that. It's a camp that's about 1.2 kilometers square. It has 22,000 people living there. The camps were set up on land that was rented from the Lebanese government for a lease of 100 years by the UN. And so they're marked, they're marked territories, and refugees are not technically meant to, build over those lines, although, as I was saying, in some of these communities they've just sort of blended with the city. But they're very, very densely populated, so 10 people living sometimes in 2 or 3 rooms. You have, very poor services. The electricity is extremely poor, and often, refugees have to kind of steal electricity from neighborhoods around the camp to bring in, the kind of the resources that they need. Similarly, water and sewage and all these kinds of things. It's a very sort of unhealthy and poor environment. But then at the same time, these are the things that are problems. But then there are also things that are, excuse me, that are very, they're very tightly bounded communities. There's great solidarity between neighbours, and they're very strong communities too. So there are a lot of things that are great about the camps, and then obviously there are other things that are very, very difficult. There's a lot of tension, obviously, because Palestinians are, living in these ghettos effectively, because they don't have the right to work and so forth. And then on the Lebanese side, there's a lot of anger towards Palestinians, because there's a perception, which has been exaggerated in many ways for political reasons, but there's a perception that, that it was the Palestinians who were responsible for the Lebanese civil war. When the PLO was there, when there was a military force in Lebanon, that ended in 1982, but before that, the Palestinian community was seen as very powerful and as having sort of destabilized the Lebanese political scene, and having brought in as having also kind of provoked the Israeli invasion. And so historically, there's a lot of animosity between the two communities. There are 2 projects that I've been talking about here. One is the Nabka Archive, which is this, as I mentioned before, is a testimonial project which I've been involved in the Palestinian refugee community in Lebanon. We've worked in all the camps, and it's a grassroots project, so it's been been run by refugees from these communities, and that's been a really important component of it. And I think whatever's good about this project is precisely the fact it comes from that it's been a collective community endeavour. And the focus of the project has been to record interviews with first-generation refugees, so people who are in their 70s and 80s, specifically about the events of 1948. So it's a very focused project. And I felt that it was very important that the recollections of refugees in the camps that for the most part haven't been documented because first-generation refugees are illiterate for the most part, and haven't had the means to, to publish memoirs or to disseminate their stories in the way that the Palestinian elite, more sort of educated elements of the Palestinian community have. And so I felt that it was very important to try and establish some kind of ongoing archival project that could, preserve these stories, which are obviously politically very, very important and continue to be, because they deal with questions of historical restitution and claims making and responsibility for what happened. And the other project that I've been involved in is called Lens on Lebanon, and that was started during the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. And like the Nabka Archive, it's a sort of grassroots media initiative, and it's really, the idea is to try and give communities that have been marginalised in the mainstream media the opportunity to represent their stories on their own terms, and to kind of document, the idea initially was to create some kind of media network that would enable villagers, people living in South Lebanon that were directly affected by the events of the war, to document the transformations of their communities, what was, happening when all the media kind of left after the ceasefire, when people, there was this kind of, people lost interest because they weren't being bombed anymore. But the idea of our project was to try and kind of really map that whole process of reconstruction and what was happening to these communities, how they were rebuilding their lives, but doing it through visual art. So we invited filmmakers and photographers, both Lebanese and international, to come and lead workshops in these villages around the south. And then we've created, exhibitions and different events that bring these different communities together. And, we'd have screenings of films, that have been made in Palestinian camps in East Beirut and Christian communities and so forth. So that's been the idea. It's obviously I see it as being very biased. There's still, the Palestinian narrative or the Palestinian perspective still somehow remains a footnote to the Israeli one. I'm simplifying here, but it's a rather huge question. But you just have to. I think you can see that the recent Gaza invasion is a good example, that the way that it's, the terms in which it was described in the media, even though it's clear that war crimes were committed, no one, the Israelis are going to get away with it again. So you feel that, international law has been, pushed aside, and Israeli national interests always take precedent over these other things. So I get quite sort of disheartened by media coverage of the conflict. There's been a tendency in a lot of the historiography that's been written about this event to draw on archives, like on military archives, on the archives of the British Mandate and of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, but the experiences of the ordinary civilians who actually lived through these events have been left to the side, and that's partly because there's traditionally been a sort of resistance to using oral history because it's seen as less legitimate, or less, it's more fallible, it's more prone to bias and these kind of distortions than documents. But the effect of that has been that, the sort of details of these events and really what the details of what happened have really remained, very unclear because there's been this sort of vast repository of experience that hasn't been tapped into. So I think that, we, in the process of doing these interviews, we recorded, we were able to document massacres that happened that have not been written about in any history books. We were able to collect oral songs and poems that were to do with the resistance, songs that people sang during the resistance period, and about Haj Amin al-Husseini and these key members of the resistance that again would be lost because they're part of an oral culture. Yeah, I am hopeful actually. The people that I've worked with are what other people, they are what give me hope, I think, because there's a kind of resilience and a humour and a kind of continued engagement with, you know, all the things that we, you know, with life and with love and with, you know, people live in very difficult situations, but they find ways to get by, and to get by in very sort of creative and live very creative and full lives too.